Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rates and Lanes podcast. I'm your host, Rico Muhammad. I will be joined shortly by my co-host, Mr. Chuck Snow. Tonight, we have our resident. I don't know what to affectionately call Dean, but Dean Croke of DAT is joining us tonight. I want to say he's something. He's our resident analyst to a degree, but we try to steal him away from DAT every now and again, and get some information out of him and see what we can glean out of him. But Dean is our guest tonight, lead analyst over at DAT. I'm probably butchering what his true title is, but he's kind of the wizard behind the curtain over there at DAT that crunches all the numbers and tell us where all the opportunity and all that stuff may lie. So he's joining us tonight. So we welcome you. It's an opportunity for you guys, if you want to jump in and you got a question or something like that, jump in the chat, put your questions in the chat. We always welcome any of your interaction. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And also, if you subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon. That way you get notified whenever we go live and videos are uploaded. You get the chance to be first in the list to get notified. So hit the bell icon, like, share, and subscribe. Do all that good stuff. It doesn't cost you a thing, but it helps us out tremendously. Puts us into a broader algorithm for the YouTube algorithm, so to speak, so we can attempt to try to get this message and get the word out to a broader audience. And with all that said, I think I hit all the housekeeping points that I needed to hit. Let me welcome my co-host in, Mr. Chuck Snow. Good evening, Chuck. How are you?
We're doing great, Rico. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there. It's been a long day, but we hanging in there.
Well, good. I was just thinking about it when you were talking about Dean, and I thought, well, how about our resident data genius?
That's a very good title for Dean. That's a very good title for him,
because he has more data than anybody else, really.
Yeah, he has the data, has all the can point us in the right direction and maybe show us where opportunity lies. So with that being said, I don't want to belabor the point. Let's bring the man, the myth, the legend. Dean, you got a lot to live up to, my friend.
Wow, that was quite the introduction. Well,
you earned it, pal.
I'm just curious. I'm always curious. I'm always interested in the why. Why is that the way it is? So
I got to ask you a question, Dean. You got a new knee. We were talking about it in the green room. Right. Is it your left knee or your right knee?
It's the right knee. It's the gas.
Oh, okay. So there's no clutching. You're good.
I rarely use the clutch ever. I'm lazy like that. I just got good hearing. I can match the gears with the RPM pretty good. But it's my gas pedal knee. So and I've only just been able to drive it last weekend. The truck, I took it for a run out to Thompson, Ohio, to the truck.
Yes, I got to ask you about that before we go on the show.
Yeah.
You drove out to Ohio to race your truck?
Yeah, in the Class C non-modified Gumby class is what I call it.
Oh man, do we got any video footage of that, Dean?
Well, so never made it to the start line because I didn't have a backup alarm. So I wasn't allowed to race because Class C rule, you've got to have a backup alarm. And I don't have one for my 2003. So, I kind of said, well, that's not the worst thing because it's a long way home if I break something. So
yes.
But I don't know if you saw my posts. I had a big slow-moving bird go through my windshield on the way out there on Thursday night at Utica, or just before near Amsterdam, New York, upstate New York on the I-90. And it was a big crane, so it was a long-legged crane, and it wasn't a scavenger bird, so it was really slow off the mark.
Right.
And I'm in the inside lane, and there's trucks on my right, and we are booking it right across the top of the Finger Lakes. And I'd look up, and there's this. I looked to my right. I was chatting to a driver, looked up, and here's this bird sitting in the middle of the road. And I thought, oh, dear, this is not going to end well for one of us. So I was calm. And I remember my dad telling me when I was a young kid as a driver, I flinched one day and swerved to miss a very big rabbit, or what we call a hare in Australia, which is like the size of a dog. And I almost rolled the truck on this dirt road. And now, you're not going to believe this, but I was only 9 years old at the time, and he was sound asleep. And he woke up and he said, "What just happened?" I said, "I swerved to miss a rabbit." And the message was, don't ever flinch when it comes to an animal, because you'll end up, in far worse off. So anyway, long story short, saw the bird, and I did move to the left of the lane a little bit. He took off to the right and clipped the hood of the radiator, dented it. You know how hard a radiator hood is on a piece. And it came through the windshield of the passenger side and put glass everywhere. And took like 2 miles to gradually slide off the side of my truck, and left a trail of, all up my truck. And so I had to get out at the next truck stop, next parking area, and tape up the entire. Thank God I had duct taped up the inside and the outside so it wouldn't implode on me. So this is my adventure, and of course I get to. I think I'll just go to Peterbilt and sleep outside and hope they've got a windshield for a 379. Of course they did. End of the story is 7 hours later and $1,000. I'm westbound again to the truck races, and I get there and they won't let me race without a backup alarm. So, and then I just turned and drove home. So that was my weekend. But the good news is I was able to drive reasonably well with my new knee. So,
oh man,
yeah. So that was my first attempt back after 6 months, guys, of being off the road. My last trip was Mid-America Truck Show in March, Chuck, where we met and had dinner. I haven't driven the truck since then, and boy, it deteriorated.
You've been starting it up and everything, correct?
What's that? Sorry?
You started up every week.
Yeah. I did have some flat batteries. I put new batteries in it, and it's funny how when trucks sit around, they degrade. I mean, trucks love to work, but I had a bunch of stuff to fix. New England salt is not good on trucks, so you always got wiring problems. But I got some air leaks.
What? It seems that when a truck sits, it just the fluids sit and they're hard on things, and the brakes get messed up, and the air in there is dirty. And no matter what you do, especially they're sitting where there's temperature changes.
Yeah,
it's not as bad sitting in a garage.
It's mostly seals, like rubber seals, airbags airbags that sit without air. They develop a crease point where they sit and they crack and break. So I go through sleeper cab airbags a lot, much more than what you would normally think. Airbags tend to degrade. Wheels get locked up, brakes get locked on drums. I had that problem. So it's been a tough 6 months, but I'm not complaining. I'm just glad to have a new knee and be able to move around again. A couple of truck shows coming up to wrap out the year. There's one this weekend, and then there's one the Sunday after. One's Trucks for Charity, raise money and awareness for kids with incredible disabilities in Hartford, Connecticut. The Trucks for Charity event, and then week after is the Big Apple Truck and Tractor Show here in Rentham, Mass, for Make-A-Wish Foundation. So this is the fall season is kind of when we have that last minute push on truck shows. And of course, they're always in New England. It means it's cold, high probability of rain. So it's hard to keep them shiny, but it's a good way to end the year with some good community events.
Yeah. And you know what? That Make-A-Wish Foundation does all sorts of wonderful stuff. What an incredible charity.
Yeah, but big year for truck shows. Part of what I talked about on Sirius XM last week, it was about the event in Thompson, Ohio, was, there's a part of the industry that's doing very well and always does very well. And it's a real community event. People race their trucks for obviously the thrill of it, but a lot of these people have fleets, whether they be construction, excavation, or an over-the-road fleet. Ray Murphy runs a fleet of trucks out of Nova Scotia hauling refrigerated seafood. He's always down here in New England, but he has some of the fastest Kenworths on the racetrack that are also line haul trucks when they're not tuned up. So there's a lot of people that, you should see these go, Rico. These things fly, but especially northbound when you get north of Bangor and you're on that I-95, man, that's a racetrack from there to the border. You'd know that, Chuck. Man, do they go. You get north of Bangor and it's like a free-for-all. So I feel very pedestrian when I get north of Bangor, mate, in my truck. So anyway, so a lot of these guys run businesses, very successful, but they bring a crew with them. And I think this is a really good point. A lot of people don't see. There's a community that is attached to each of these fleets. They're the mechanics, the workshop guys, the electricians, family and friends, and they all go to these events with their camper vans, and the trucks are on trailers. Right. And when you look around the entire race circuit, you can see the fabric of the trucking industry. It's the future truck drivers coming through the workshop, because they have a passion for the industry. It sort of struck me about how there's a progression through the various stages of the trucking business through truck racing. It's fairly hard to do otherwise, but there's a lot of experience that gets transferred, and of course it's a lot of fun when you meet up with these guys. And Chuck, there was a bunch of people from Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia at this event in Ohio, because truck racing really started in Quebec.
Yeah, that's right. The event you went to in northern Quebec.
The story is that 42 years ago, two guys, and I don't know their names, but we could probably find out, in St. Joseph de Beauce, were sitting at the top of that hill that they block off the main street, and were betting on a beer about whose truck was fastest up the hill. Story goes that they rang the police with a fictitious crime that was happening at the other side of town, out towards St. George's. Right. And as soon as the police headed out that way, they got the trucks out and raced up and down this hill to prove who was the fastest. And that's how the truck races started in Quebec. That's a totally feasible story, right?
Yeah, and knowing those guys, because they're
that sounds like something some truck drivers would
Yeah, so that's how and of course they have like 6 or 7 of these, and it's not just a truck race, it's a festival. And the difference between, so what I was going to say is, this is probably the 2nd or 3rd year that the Americans, mainly in Minnesota, Michigan, and Ohio, are now starting to do truck races uphill, bobtail loaded, similar to what's been going on for decades in Canada. So that's starting to come online now. Much the same, but the carriers are the same. The guns that are the really fast trucks that are, I don't know that they work, but these are heavily worked over trucks, and they go really fast. I mean, these are trucks that wheel spin loaded off the starting line. There's the Koga racing team that we see in Quebec a lot are in the logging business. I've seen inside this truck, it's got a 4,000 RPM tacho. It's got 80 pounds of turbo boost coming out of a C15.
Good God.
The C15 block's pumping out 3,000 horsepower.
Whoa!
And when Nicolas Gagnon, the driver, who's Koga Racing, drops the clutch at 4,000 RPM, you would think there'd be all sorts of things break. This thing sits there and wheel spins loaded and tears up the track. The best part is that no one in a high performance race car can stick with him bobtail up the hill. He beats everybody. This thing is so fast off the start. So this is a whole nother side of the industry that you'd never.
How does he keep from snapping the drive shaft?
They have non-slip clutches. They have heavy-duty drivetrains. Now, that said, they did put up fences 2 years ago because someone's clutch came out the side and the U-joint blew and someone got hurt. So yes, they do. There is damage, but if you look at the race trucks, they've got very thick conveyor belt rubber all around the drive shafts and the engine housing underneath to stop stuff coming out, because yes, stuff breaks.
Oh yeah.
Not as often as you think, but they come with a whole truckload of parts. Nothing to see someone swapping out a transmission in between heats up in the parking lot. It's unbelievable, Rico.
That's the culture up in
Exactly.
in the North Country.
Yeah.
These guys are used to, they're hauling, heavy loads.
Yep.
And stuff breaks every day.
Exactly.
Just like your background, Dean, when you were in the Outback,
right,
and stuff broke, you guys had all your own tools and all your own parts, and I bet you there were some old timers there that when a motor went, they'd start working on them.
Well, it was a lot of beer was drunk between then and getting it back on the road, because the time off the road is measured by how many beers you've got to think through it. So
that's how it was in the old days. You just did repairs at the side of the road because there weren't a lot of wreckers.
Right.
I remember when I got into the business, there was an old guy by the name of Roy Clow. He had the old-time trucker. I called him one Friday afternoon. I needed or Saturday afternoon. I needed a reefer. I didn't even know the guy, and somebody had promised us a reefer and didn't come through, and the guy lied to me. And so I remember calling Roy Clow, and he said, yeah, come on over. You can borrow one of mine. And we did, and it worked. It's a long story, but I was telling somebody about it. He said, Roy Clow. He said, let me tell you about Roy Clow. He said, I remember when a guy's engine blew, and at the side of the road, we were all helping him pull the engine out of a truck. And Roy Clow put a chain around his shoulders and was reefing on the chain. You know, these were old time truckers. You know, they don't make them anymore. You know, like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and the thing though that I think you'll appreciate, guys, is that truckers get a rough time here in the US. I think, in the most part, they're not considered, you know, the essential workers that we were during the pandemic. They get a pretty hard time on the roads. I think as a lot of car drivers find them more of a hindrance than an essential part of the economy. Very different in Canada. So my take on this is that in Canada, Canada's more old school in terms of how trucking is looked at by the broader community. I think it's because Canada is a lot more rural. And Chuck, check me on this, but I think it's a lot more rural, and a lot more people in Canada are tightly connected to all of the industries and the truckers in the towns, like the sawmill, the paper mill, the log trucks, the forest.
It's the largest employer in Canada.
It's the logging industry.
Trucking industry. Now, it's not obviously not all drivers,
right?
But it is. It's dispatchers, it's mechanics, it's claims people, it's you know, all sorts of different positions, but it is the number one employer. And the other thing is, we only have 2 railways in this whole country, and we're a bigger country than you geographically. The rail never could handle everything,
right?
So a lot of things go on trucks still.
Yeah, it's a good point, because in St. Joseph de Beauce on the Labor Day weekend, they closed down obviously most of the town for the truck race itself and the music festival that goes over 4 days. A lot of people camping. There's thousands of people that go to this event. But the main part of it for the truckers is the parade on the Saturday night that takes about 4 hours from the first truck to the last truck. And they parade through town. The best part is the people that aren't truckers that come out with their chairs and sit on the lawns of all of the houses and line the entire 5 to 6 kilometer route. And it is wall-to-wall people on either side cheering and waving. And of course, if you've got hearing sensitivity, it's not a good place to be, because everybody these days have got train horns going, and they are blasting train horns the whole way. And it's so loud, but the people love it, and the kids love it, and they're waving. And so I couldn't see that happening here in the US. I just couldn't envision the town doing that.
It's also in Quebec, where they depend on trucks for everything. There's just not a lot of rail service. That, you know, they certainly need trucks to keep the mill going. You know, and that's still that's wood country. You know, whether it's paper or wood, that's where an awful lot of wood is produced.
You know, and it's probably a size thing too. You know, it's very much the same in Australia. You've got a lot more regional, you know, local truck companies and families that are intertwined with the industry. Maybe this is just an artifact of the size of the American economy and how many people we've got here. It's just not possible to have that sort of same trucking culture. But sort of that's sort of the comparison I'd like to draw between the two is Canadians generally are very proud of their truck drivers for the most part. And then there's always a part of every industry that gives us a bad name, but the Canadians do it really well.
Well, thank you.
Speaking of economy.
Yeah. Let's dig into the data.
Yeah. A question is for each segment type. What is the outlook been so far for each? You know, if we let's try to break it down: reefer, flatbed, and dry van, and kind of get us up to date, Dean, on what the how things are looking.
Yeah, I'll start off with you know, we could start with you know, we can probably come back to diesel, because I think that's important. We talk about diesel prices vis-a-vis the Middle East crisis and the potential impact there. Heating oil season, we've got maintenance season. There's a few things going on truckers need to think about. rates generally have are still bottoming out. Now, I'm going to sound like a cracked record because we were talking about the market bottoming out in March this year. We honestly thought that the freight market would have bottomed out at the start of spring this year. It didn't happen. Demand was weaker, but
Right.
part of why rates continued their downward slide for the best part of the year was we still had way too many trucks for loads, and we still have that case today, Rico. We've still got an excess of capacity in the market, and it's got a lot to do with the fact that the number of carriers that entered the long haul sector doubled from the middle of 2020 to the end of 2021. Right. And it wasn't until Russia invaded the Ukraine and diesel jumped to $1.43 a gallon in the first part of last year before we started to see a lot of those new entrants faced with higher diesel, lower rates exit the industry. But the exodus of carriers from the industry has been relatively slow, much slower than you would have thought, because carriers were coming off an 18-month period, which was arguably the most profitable in their history during the pandemic. And I was talking to Todd Amon today about this, and I said, carriers had a lot of equity, a lot of carriers. You heard the earnings calls of the large carriers talking about record earnings, record income. On his small end of the business, and the owner-operators said he was seeing carriers making more profit than they've ever made before as owner-operators. But what had happened, and he said that, we think the money has finally run out.
Definitely has run out.
So it's a really interesting thing when you look at it, because why we think that's the case, we've been tracking the exodus of carriers that revoke their authorities to haul interstate freight. We track it on a monthly basis. It's been relatively flat for about 4 months. We've been losing about 10, 11,000 carriers a month over that period of time.
That's flat?
Yeah. So, so why it's flat, Rico, is there's the equal number of carriers joining.
Jeez.
Really?
So, in 12 months, we've lost 124,000 carriers in the long haul sector, but we've gained 122.
Jeez.
So it's a crazy market. And I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine, Davy Pedro, sold his truck about 6 months ago, bought it at the start of the pandemic, ran for $4 a mile for 18 months, made a lot of money, paid off his $50,000 truck, did really well, got out early, been driving an asphalt truck. Just last weekend, he's bought a 9-car auto hauler. And because truck prices have dropped below 2018 levels. Right. So I think there are folks out there that are repositioning themselves, made some pretty good money, have a little bit of cash, and they're back in the business. The thing is that there's always people joining this industry. I think, Rico, they're not the same people that are joining that are leaving. I think the long haul sector is losing ground. I think the first mile and final mile are picking up ground, like hot shot, straight trucks, lift gates, expediters. I think that's where the growth is in the industry right now.
Well, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense, because there's more and more of a demand, especially when you're talking about the white glove and final mile. Amazon and Alibaba and all the rest of them are all they're all promising. Even Walmart up here is promising home delivery for large bulky items.
Yeah, we're on track to lose. I'm just looking at the data now. We've lost about 8,000 carriers at the middle point of August on the long haul sector. We're on track to lose, if it keeps going at this rate, that'll be an exodus of about 20,000 carriers. That could be the biggest loss of interstate carriers since June of 2019. We could surpass that. June of 2019 was when we had record bankruptcies. Celadon, New England Motor Freight, all those carriers. So it looks like, I'm not sure we covered this in our last show, but I sort of predicted that with the surge in diesel prices, the average is up about 70 cents a gallon since July 4. Right? My theory was that eventually that cash flow crunch would happen. Carriers would eventually be forced out of the industry once they were unable to afford their fuel bills. And it feels and looks like that's happening this month. So this could see an exodus of carriers. What that does is right-size the market. So it kind of starts to rebalance the market in terms of the right number of trucks for loads. So that the unfortunate part of this is carriers exit the industry. The upside is that capacity starts to match demand, Because right now, why rates drop is they drop because there's more capacity.
More capacity in there.
As capacity leaves, the market starts to rebalance itself. So when you think about demand being very soft in what's peak season, like the freight demand there's no needle moving events right now. Capacity exiting the industry will be what sort of turns spot rate around. So the good news is that as capacity leaves, spot rates start to bottom out and then go back up. But right now they're bottoming out, and they're still bottoming out, and they have been for 3 or 4 weeks now at about $1.60 a mile in dry van, excluding the fuel surcharge.
And you know what? It's costing them way over that top rate.
Yeah.
They're losing money. Now, my understanding, Dean, is that the financial institutions and the leasing companies, the finance companies, all of them were reluctant to start repossessing trucks, but that reluctance has passed now, and now they are starting to repossess. What have you heard on your end?
Similar story, largely because they were reluctant, I think, because the debt level was far in excess of what the trucks were worth as the market came back down to normal. So, you're talking about trucks that were $40,000 long term, hitting $110,000, $120,000 at the peak of the pandemic, and they've come right back down to long term levels, those 40,000 levels. So, there was, I think, they probably would have been thinking there's a chance the carriers can trade out of this if the market turns, and that's part of the challenge. Is a lot of these carriers have been running for fairly low rates to try and generate some revenue per truck day to just pay their bills. I mean, there's a lot of carriers that have just been on thin ice for so long. You can only absorb that for so long. But Chuck, you touched on a really good point, and I got asked this question on a JP Morgan earnings call today, or an investor call. So the average, if you look at the average operating cost for an owner-operator, it's about $1.90 a mile based on all of my analytics and my model, and it's turned out to be pretty accurate because it's based on real-life operating costs of trucks, including my own. So if you take $1.90 and say that's the average, 100,000 miles a year, 15,000 miles loaded, 35 cents a mile for finance, I'm paying $900 on my trailer, $2,500 on my tractor, I'm paying $12,000 a year on insurance, which is on the light end. So I picked an average owner operator in the spot market. It's about $1.90 a mile. Now, here's where some carriers can survive and others struggle. Because if you've paid off your own debt and you own your own truck and trailer, you could take 35 cents a mile off that $1.90 because you own your own assets. Right. You don't need the 35 to cover payments. You could comfortably run for $1.55 a mile. And that's way below where spot rates are now. And I know carriers are doing that. Now, you can't do that for long, and because I know what Rico's thinking. That's a short way because you're not generating a return on your capital employed in the business, right? So you'll go out
and every mile you turn, that truck is wearing down, and you're going to need a motor job. And a truck like yours, I can imagine it's probably $50,000 or $60,000 to rebuild that motor.
It is, and you're trading down though. If you don't get a return on the equity that you could have had in the bank, and if it's in the truck, there's a cents per mile attached to the capital employed in a business. A lot of carriers don't factor in the capital requirement to get a return on the capital employed in terms of a rate per mile. So if you're running for just break even, you can't build that $30,000-$40,000 rebuild equity you need. There's all sorts of things that'll go wrong. You're a breakdown away from serious trouble, but they can get by. But on the flip side, if you paid a lot during the last 18 months for a used truck, you paid way more than you should have, and you're a new entrant and got stung with $25,000 per powered unit. I've done the modeling on that same truck that cost me $1.90 as an average. If I'm a new entrant, I'm needing $2.15 to get by.
Yeah.
So the range.
That is a huge discrepancy.
And this is because of the pandemic.
Right.
So because I had, on one end of the pandemic, I could earn a lot of money and pay off debt. I came in too late in the market cycle. I paid too much for my trucks and insurance, and I'm being caught on the way down now. So it's not a normal market because of the range of operating costs. This is really abnormal, and that's why some carriers can get by. It helps drive rates down also because everyone's chasing those loads. So that's part of the reason the exodus of carriers has been very slow, is because it's not a normal market, because the spread in operating costs is really wide for the the independent owner operator side of the industry. So
you're right, but I think the biggest thing is that the new entrants did create. They had such positive wins that if they saved their money and they didn't buy stupid stuff like put chrome mud flaps on their truck and all the other stuff,
right?
And they put their money in the bank, they can hang on for a while.
Yeah, I think because if you think about the part of it, I mean, what started this was the 6 months when the pandemic happened. That period, from the middle of June to the end of 2021, those 6 months started all of this. And then there were three things that happened. PPP loans ended. Diesel dropped 73 cents a gallon in that 6 months, and rates went up $1 per mile. So when diesel drops and rates go up,
right,
margins go through the roof, and it set up a scenario where people were dragged like bees to honey into this market in 2021, and because the times were good, like the was good for 2021, and things were progressing pretty well into 2022, but of course things dramatically turned then. So if you look at that 18-month period, we are still experiencing the fallout from that today. It's like 2021 was the party, 2023 is the hangover.
You got it, and it's a doozer. So, it's a 4 aspirin hangover.
Because of all these abnormal factors, like carriers made so much money, and they were able to ride out a lot of the high diesel prices last year. It's taken a lot long for capacity to leave the industry, and that's why spot market rates have been so low for so long, because capacity's been hanging in there. And of course, on the demand side, there's no catalyst that's going to drive the market up. We're not suddenly going to have more loads to haul.
Right.
There's nothing happening that might suddenly change that. Now, of course, the wild card is if the Middle East crisis expands to, the broader Middle East region where 80% of the world's crude oil reserves are, and then you've got Iran, which has got like 16% of the oil reserves in the world. When you start dragging those folks into this conflict, suddenly global oil supplies dwindle. So that's why, when you hear the government talking to Venezuela about easing sanctions there, that's all about trying to rebalance the supply of crude so that we don't end up with a surge in diesel prices. That's sort of the biggest fear right now, is as the market digests what's going on, we've got a truckload market that's already on the edge. Operating costs are already much higher because of the cost of diesel, and rates aren't going up anytime soon. If there's a surge in diesel prices, you could only imagine what that will do to not just spot market carriers, but other, medium fleets as well.
Well, that will shake everything up the wrong direction, because what'll happen, I think, if we have a surge in diesel prices, you'll have a lot more carriers that are going to have financial problems.
Yep.
It's not going to do anything positive for inflation,
right?
Because your farmers, your producers, your distributors, everybody's costs go up, so that food costs go up.
Yep.
Cost of living goes up. The cost for the average North American to get to work or pick his kids up or to do anything is going to increase.
So I quick question, Dean, to kind of transition just a little bit, but it's kind of in the same vein. Seasonality. I know we're going into quote unquote holiday season, so you got some things I know, like for instance, sweet potatoes are probably picking up.
Yep.
A lot more of turkeys and things of that nature getting ready to go to market. From when it comes, I'm just thinking about from a reefer standpoint.
Yeah, not quite. We're not quite there. We're in the lull. I guess it's sort of a slack tide. Like we're in between the high tide and the low tide, Rico. Middle of October is typically the slack tide.
Mm-hmm.
You come off July 4, peak produce season, and then it gets very slack until the end of October. And when you get to the end of October, typically seasonality starts to kick in.
That's when it picks up.
Yeah, fall produce kicks in Washington, Oregon, Twin Falls, Idaho, Spokane, or Spokane as they say, Washington. Spokane's in Washington, right?
Right.
So that whole Pacific Northwest starts to come alive. It's not helping that produce volumes out of California are down 13% year over year. It's a big deal because California contributes about a quarter of our truckload reefer volume. That's putting a drag on the market right now. New York State's not having the best of produce seasons. So produce is not sort of delivering what you'd normally expect. So put produce aside. Turkeys don't start moving until 3 weeks from Thanksgiving. Obviously, pumpkins are going to be moving out of Bloomington, Illinois market. They're the capital of the world. Pumpkin production is Morton, Illinois. So if you look at Southwest Illinois, there'll be a lot of demand for reefers out of there in the next week or so for pumpkins for carving. It's also home to Nestle's big factory where they make they can pumpkins.
Right.
So there's a lot of freight that comes out of there for that. So we will see a lift there, Rico. Typically, pumpkins don't move the national needle,
Right.
but turkeys do. So frozen turkeys are moving all year round, obviously because they're frozen. But fresh moved 3 weeks out from Thanksgiving. That also overlaps with Christmas tree season, which with the peak is the week before Thanksgiving. So that's when we start to see reefer dry van rates and even flatbed start to go up, is in that 2 to 3 week period before Thanksgiving. And it'll be very hard to find reefers and dry vans in the Pacific Northwest when Christmas trees start moving. They start moving Hawaiian Christmas trees now in containers. They'll move Christmas trees for wreaths probably in the next week or so for the wreath market. Right. And then when you get to about 2 weeks out from the Monday after Thanksgiving, all hell breaks loose in the long haul reefer market because they want Christmas trees in reefers. And then you start to get into the, when you get closer to Christmas, you'll see a lot more Christmas tree moving on whatever's got rubber under it. Right. So that's kind of and then you overlay that with peak retail shopping season and store replenishment. So typically from the end of October, seasonality kicks in, and we start to see rates go up all the way through to Christmas, and then the wheels fall off again in the first quarter of the year. So if you overlay that with capacity exiting the industry on the spot market side, you could see capacity tightening. But I think a lot of large carriers still have excess capacity. I think there's more trucks parked on the fence because they got them into the trade cycle. Right. But they could seat them if they wanted to, right? If there was demand. So I think we've got a lot more trucks hitting the used truck market. Trade cycles are certainly increasing. Used truck inventory is increasing from the large fleets. So as to whether this moves the national needle, I'm a little bit reluctant to say it will, because I think there's still a rebalancing going on, as we get through this last quarter of the year. We may see some markets produce pretty good revenue. So those markets that I talked about, like Pendleton, Twin Falls, out of the Yakima Valley, out of Portland, Medford markets, you'll see really, really good rates out of there. And if I could, I'm not sure I've got my Pendleton data right.
You'll see good rates if there's no trucks. If there's a lot of trucks there, the rates will go down because that's what always happens.
Yeah, they're sitting, Oregon and Washington state rates for reefer are sitting at about $2 a mile right now, excluding fuel. Right. Now, that's a good southbound rate if you can get up there, but they will go somewhere about 40 to 50 cents a mile higher by the end of the year, according to our RateCast forecasting tool. So to your point about seasonality, Rico, it's more at the regional level, right? So there's always tight capacity for sweet potatoes out of eastern North Carolina. Always, right? So there'll be tight capacity out of the Pacific Northwest. There'll be tight capacity for Christmas trees out in Quebec and northern Maine. Guaranteed once you start to get there.
And in that North Carolina market in particular, just because I'm familiar with it so well, is you got a couple of different things, because you got sweet potatoes coming out. Of course, that's the sweet potato capital of the world. And you got several turkey plants up that way, along with a lot of chicken plants as well, and also pork. There's a lot of pork that comes out of North Carolina up there. That's Smithfield, up in that area, up and around there. So there's a lot of in that particular region, like you say, regionality. Definitely a lot of opportunity to be had there when it comes to when the season kicks in.
Rico, it's one of the only markets that the USDA reports a shortage of trucks on almost every week is sweet potatoes out of North Carolina.
Right.
So if you think about that, you mentioned pork and turkeys and sweet potatoes. Of course, there are a lot of the things that we use on Thanksgiving. The same will be said for the Midwest markets, where you go a little bit west of the Mississippi River, where a lot of your chicken and poultry plants are, close to the grain markets. a lot of the chicken plants and turkey processing plants and coal stores are all up and down that whole belt, all the way from Minnesota all the way down into Mississippi. It's going to be very hard to find a refrigerated trailer in that market. You typically see on the contract side first tender rejection rates in the 40s and low 50s. So that means that half of the loads that are tendered by the big shippers are rejected because the spot rates are so attractive. Now, you've got to get there, right? So you've got to get to those distant markets for the right rate before you can come back out. So there'll be a lot of regional opportunities for carriers if they're clever about which markets to position their assets in. Pacific Northwest is a given. Upstate New York to a degree, but a lot of that's regional short haul. Christmas trees will obviously be a big market, but of course they're multi-drop, live load, take forever to get unloaded. Sap gets everywhere. You need a leaf blower to get all the needles out of your truck. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to that. And I think the other market I'd watch is as we get into winter, the lettuce production shifts from Salinas to Yuma, Arizona.
Right.
In November to March, the whole so we go from the summer salad bowl in Salinas to the winter salad bowl in the bottom of the Rio Grande River there in Yuma. So Yuma becomes the center point for leafy greens. About 90% of our demand is met by that particular small patch of the country over winter. And the other one is that as the produce markets are sort of in the slack season, you'll see a lot more volume coming in from South America into Philadelphia. Philadelphia will be the #1 port for import refrigeration loads. Now, it's not just, when I say refrigeration, it's not just in a container. It'll be in a break bulk vessel, which will be the palletized. They bring, like 20 pallets out in a big net.
Right.
It's a different configuration. So,
Okay.
yeah, they bring them in break bulk reefers a lot because they're the ones that can get into the small ports along the west coast of South America, sorry. So you'll see a lot of produce comes up through the Panama Canal from the west coast of South America, and it lands in Philadelphia primarily. It's not the only port, but Philadelphia is really well equipped at the Packer Marine Terminal for importing produce. So it's a strong market for refrigerated carriers if you're looking for loads. And of course, Chuck will know this as they shut down the St. Lawrence Seaway because they removed the navigation buoys because of the ice. A lot of Quebec, a lot of that volume that would go up on the break bulk reefers through the St. Lawrence Seaway into Canada will come into southern ports, some of the Boston ports, Rhode Island ports, and in particular Philadelphia. And out of Philadelphia, you're like 9-10 hours, you're in Toronto. So you'll see a shift. I guess the point I'm making there is that produce season shifts from being your traditional growing markets to very small regional markets based on temperature. And then of course you get into January and you've got strawberry season, blueberry season starting in Lakeland, Florida. So I think that when you look at the national levels, it really hides where the opportunity is. And I think that's what you've got to look at when people listening to the show is the opportunities are locally, regionally. I talk to brokers. Brokers are really doing it tough at the moment. They're in the bottom of the market because their margins are being compressed because they've been tendering contracts that are coming down and carriers are at rock bottom. And they're sort of saying, what can we do? And I keep saying, think more like a carrier. Think 5 loads at a time. Don't think 1 load at a time because 1 load doesn't really help me as a carrier from A to B.
Yeah, that's the smaller brokers are more transactional.
Yeah,
and the larger brokers can't be. They're more based on contract.
But they have the data though. Like they have the network of officers and the people and the loads to help carriers figure out A to B to C to D back to A. The data's there. We're working on models to help us do that through artificial intelligence and some pretty clever computer programs to figure that out. But I think that's the next evolution of data science in transport is building freight models that simulate how drivers think, in terms of loads.
Right.
And it's doable because, if I can do it, if we can do it in our heads, we can get a computer to do that too eventually.
It's not just how they think, but how they work.
Yeah.
Because not everybody is a super trucker anymore that can do 600 miles a day. A lot of these new guys can do 470, whatever. They just can't push it to 600 or 650.
Yeah. Yeah. Rico, you asked about I've got some regional rates here that I could share with you
Sure.
that paint that picture about regional opportunity. The south and the southeast and southwest, just over $2 a mile. When you think that's all including the fuel surcharge. But the Midwest market, Minnesota out to Minneapolis, Minnesota, Nebraska, $2.34 a mile has been the national average. The West Coast is $2.10 an average. Only $1.95 in the Northeast. Bit better for refrigerated carriers, but again, a similar story. The lower performing regions are the southeast and southwest markets. They're averaging 222 to 230. But up in the Midwest, we're starting to see some of this poultry production and fall produce, particularly potatoes and onions, 285 a mile.
Whoa.
In the Midwest region, and 251 a region in the West. When the West region includes everything from the Dakotas all the way down to Phoenix, Arizona, and all points west. But 251 kind of masks the higher rates in the Pacific Northwest because that's where produce season is right now. So that rate's probably a little bit higher in the Pacific Northwest. So there's sort of where some of the opportunities are for carriers. Regionally is certainly the places I'd be looking at and trying to run lanes that were specific to, a tight range where I could get 550, 600 miles a day fairly consistently on those lanes and have very little downtime in between. Flatbed, again, the opposite though, Rico. Your part of the world is the best performing. Midwest is still a little bit better, but 258 a mile in the southeast, 247 in the southwest. So they are the two leading markets. The Midwest markets aren't as big. So when I say they're 268 a mile, those markets aren't as big for flatbed carriers as the South is, because that's where you've got most of your single family homes and steel production.
Right.
So they're bumping up on 268 as an average in your part of the world. And it's boosted a lot by the flatbed market, short haul flatbed market in Lakeland and Miami. A lot of flatbed rate moves regionally in Florida, but you do see a decent amount of long haul out of Birmingham and other Mississippi markets. Yeah. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for carriers regionally, but the high volume lanes. When I looked at the top 5 states this week in terms of rate directionality, and this is a really telling point about how soft the market is. I looked at the top 5 freight producing states for spot market loads and contract: California, Georgia, Illinois, New Jersey, and Texas. The average spot rate for those lanes was $1.72 a mile. So it's higher than the national average of $1.57. But at $1.72 a mile for your top 5 states, that's only 5 cents a mile higher than 2019.
Yeah, in California, if you're talking California being in there, you know how expensive fuel is in California. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you a data point. This will blow you away. September containerized imports came in a little bit higher. Volume of containers coming in are only 3% lower than 2019, to give you a sense of where they are. But what we saw in 2021 and 2022 was a lot of those imports had to find a home, and there was a lot of spot market volume moving out of California to Stockton, to Denver, Phoenix, and to Phoenix, Denver, Stockton were the 3, a little bit to Texas.
Right.
So if you think, and I'll give you some data points about where rates were at the end of 2021 and what they are now, and it's staggering how soft the market is. Stockton loads were, let me see here, Stockton loads, Phoenix, we've got Phoenix loads here, averaged $2.76 a mile last week. That's about $2 a mile lower than the peak in late 21. Los Angeles to Stockton, which is one of the biggest lanes for spot market moves on the West Coast, averaged $2.48 a mile. That's excluding fuel. That's $2.25 a mile lower than 2021. And the biggest lane for intermodal moves, which we compete with rail a lot on, is Los Angeles to Chicago, where a third of intermodal container moves occur. Rates averaged $1.34 a mile last week, Chuck. That's $2 a mile exactly lower than the end of 2021.
Whoa.
So West Coast has really dropped off the face of the map in terms of volume.
Now, is some of that on the rail? Do you
Yeah.
think that's because people have decided to ship to other ports other than?
Partly, that we've got a guest on our show next week talking about that. John McCown's an international rail expert, but it's partly because the congestion's gone away. They've got a new labour agreement in place, and the railroads have a lot of capacity and pretty cheap rates. They've kind of won the market share on those long haul lanes. So what shippers have done, instead of going to Houston and Savannah via the Panama Canal, they've said, wow, we can get a pretty good inland move at a cheap price on intermodal, and we can get through the port very quickly. Why don't we go back there? So there's been a little bit of that, and but then the aggressive infrastructure development on the East Coast is giving shippers better options to move freight around Savannah and Elizabeth, New Jersey, New York City, Norfolk, those sorts of ports. So I think a little bit of that move to the East Coast will stick. But right now, pure economics mean that it's a better play to be sending your import freight that's destined for the inland of the US via Chicago. It's a better play to be sending that to Los Angeles and Long Beach ports. So that's sort of the wrap up of the markets. I think Rico asked about seasonality and spot rates. I'll give you some data points around spot market volumes. Spot market volumes in dry van are about half what they were a year ago. Same with reefer. The scary data point is that flatbed volumes on the spot market are 37% lower than 2019. So flatbed is a really, really soft market. No surprise, high interest rates, not a lot of single family homes being built. So we have a big backlog. And I think what's interesting is you say, well, where does all this lead? I heard a good analogy last week, and it was a weather analogy, because we were at our DATCon conference in Houston, and we had about 77 shippers there. So these 77 shippers represent about 60 billion in freight spend. It's a lot of loads when you put it all down. So the biggest shippers in the country. They are acutely aware that the storm is coming, and right now they're fixing the roof, was the analogy. So they know that carriers are leaving the industry. They are very worried about their incumbent carriers' health. So they are concerned. They want rate reductions, but not at the expense of blowing out a carrier so they're not around next year.
That's great to hear.
It's good news. So I think
there is some empathy from shippers, because I got to tell you, many times I had meetings with people that said, listen, I like to deal with carriers that aren't, we don't really want to deal with you because you're too secure. I'd rather deal with a guy that's not, because I can push them around a lot easier.
Yeah, well, that's the ones that are going to suffer in this market. So I was encouraged to hear that, because what they've done, this is very interesting data point, they've worked more closely with their incumbents. The data point that struck me that was staggering was that 15% of the lanes in the contract world account for about 80% of the volume in the contract market and 72% of the spend.
Wow.
Just 15% of the lanes. So what they've done is they've locked in capacity with the large carriers on those lanes, and made sure they got capacity when the market turns. And this is why the spot market volumes have doubled in the last year, is because rather than put those low volume lanes, which could be a load a week or a load every 2 weeks, which is almost always going to be rejected by a large carrier, right? And it falls through the routing guide out into the spot market.
Right.
What they've done, instead of putting it into an RFP tender and asked every carrier for a rate on essentially what's going to be a ghost lane that freight never materializes on, they pulled them out of the RFP and they go direct to the broker market for that like strategic buy on the spot market in advance, right? So they're not waiting for the day of. It's a controlled spend. So this is a really interesting trend where shippers are sending more direct to the spot market rather than through the traditional waterfall process where, your cheapest rate rejects it, then the second highest rate rejects it, and it falls through the waterfall concept through the routing guide out into the spot market when everyone says no. So that's different this time. There's more volume. I mean, the pie has shrunk, but the amount of the pie that spot market has doubled since 2019. So that's good news for carriers that can talk to shippers about their low volume lanes. That's
Yeah,
what the
that's
opportunity is.
So that's really where the opportunity lies for
Yep.
the small guys is
Yep.
to go in and talk to these guys about this the lower volume lanes that are
One
available.
load a week, one load every 2 weeks. I'm your guy.
Yeah, because you know what, you can if you're a small operator, you can make gold out of that because now you know you've got a load once a week from Massachusetts to Ohio.
Yep.
You can build on that.
Well, especially if you've got a good contract outbound from your hometown for that local shipper, right?
Yeah.
You know, Rico, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here because you just pick up I was going to say the phone book, but you wouldn't be picking up a phone book today. But what you'd do is you'd simply go and look for all the shippers in that area where you're coming back out of and just call. Like you could start with brokers who know that area, but if you want to build a business on that lane, look for shippers that have got a load going back to where you need to get to.
Right.
It's marketing. It's like, you know, I could see Rico in his uniform and his whole package. You know, that's a fairly easy sale for me if I'm a shipper. So I think that's where the opportunity is. I love that you picked up on that, Rico, because a lot of carriers miss that. They think it's only a spot market play. What you want is a balance of contract and spot, of course.
Well, the biggest thing is, and that's something that we try to do on this show and try to, you know, maybe not make it as big of a hairy monster as some people may think it is. And sometimes it's just, you know, getting out of your own way of being able to go have that conversation. A lot of people are just afraid to hear no.
Right.
They're afraid to even approach, you know, they're just flat out terrified of it. And it's much easier.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's much easier to sit around and just complain about how bad the brokers are treating you.
Yeah, like, and this is not hard. You know, it's hard to do for a lot of people that are really good at driving trucks and loading loads. Like, it's, you know, I always found it hard. I had a job in Australia where I used to drive a B-double road train, you know, for half the day, and then I'd change at lunchtime into a suit and tie and go and sell freight to get the trucks loaded back out. It was hard to switch gears mentally from being a truck driver, fighting traffic and people and forklift drivers.
Yeah, it definitely takes a little bit of
it's doable
bandwidth, but it's definitely doable.
You can do it.
You don't have to, and like you said, you can really just you can break it down and make it easier and more palatable just by focusing on one thing at a time. You don't have to build the whole thing at once.
And Rico, the important thing is this is where you get away from the rate per mile rate and belly aching about low rates. Exactly. Because a low rate to one carrier is profit to another carrier. Like It depends on your business, because you've got a lot of carriers that got good head haul rates can come back for a lower rate. You need to get, you know, in the market and be not thinking one load at a time, but thinking about how do I build lane density. You know, I've got to have loads going back and forward all the time on a regular, predictable basis. It's entirely doable in this market. I think there's a lot of shippers. I think what's happened in the pandemic is a lot of shippers realized that brokers were a viable solution. Brokers and 3PLs stepped up to the plate and got stuff moved. And to our credit, we did that very, very well as an industry. But what shippers are stuck with now is this mindset that, hey, brokers are no longer a four-letter word. You know, like you know, spot market's no longer a four-letter word. It's a strategic place to go, not just to get emergency overflow freight moved, but to get my low volume freight moved where I want it done consistently. That's a shift in the last 2 years that I'm not sure a lot of smaller carriers, you know, have resonated with, but hopefully listening to the show, they'll pick up on that.
You know, the hardest part, and there's not a lot of jobs in a brokerage or trucking company that I haven't done at one time. And the hardest thing about selling as a carrier, you know, if you're based in, I'm going to use Rico, for example, he's based in Atlanta and he's looking for loads between Atlanta and North Carolina. And he makes phone calls and he goes, listen, I run between Atlanta and North Carolina. And they go, well, that's really nice, but we have loads going into Delaware and we have loads going into Ohio and we have some going into California, but we don't run those other things. And we had that happen all the time selling as a carrier.
Right.
Now, of course, when you sell as a broker, it doesn't matter. You're just selling a multitude of services, and that's the difference. And that's where I think, especially today, when even if these carriers or these shippers do have freight that's going from Atlanta to North Carolina, they go, yeah, Rico, well, we do have that, but we're dealing with C.H. Robinson or Chop Tank or whoever.
Right.
And we would, you know what, they get all our freight.
Yeah.
Because it's just, you know, an awful lot of them today. The large shippers,
Hmm.
they just download all their, they don't even deal with it anymore. They just take all their freight spend and they download it once a week, once a day, once a month even.
Right.
Tell the broker here. And sometimes the broker is the logistics arm of those big motor carriers, so the Schneiders and the Werners and all, and JB Hunt and the rest of the crew. And if they're a big shipper, you know, the General Motors of the world, they've got thousands of loads and they don't want to deal with the one-offs.
Right.
That's the biggest problem I found in sales.
Yeah.
But you know, if you're willing to grind it out,
finding the smaller, but like you say, there's an opportunity that's there to be had if you can find the smaller, the smaller shipper that's not a major conglomerate. There may be an opportunity to be had that
100%
is there that people are I think that maybe neglecting to try to take advantage of. And the answer to the unasked question is always the default answer is always no if you don't go out and approach.
Yeah. But I think, Rico, what I do to answer Chuck's dilemma there is if I go and call on a shipper and they've got a load in the other direction, I'd be going in with a consortium of owner-operators like you and your buddies, and they're all looking for loads in different areas. I've got good friends that want to run Presque Isle, Maine to Charlotte, North Carolina. And if I'm in Atlanta and they don't have an Atlanta load, I'd just simply say I know a guy. You know, my partner, you know, this may not be a legal relationship, but I know someone that runs that lane that's perfect for your business. And then when he's out marketing, he'll eventually come up with someone that wants to run Charlotte to Atlanta.
They killed a lot of that too. I don't know how many people were taking advantage of it, but when they did the MAP 21, they took away the ability for carriers to be able to interline with one another without having a broker's license. So you know that kind of hurt a little bit of that. But
there's a way. You know what? I've been playing. I've talked to Rico about this, and I'll throw it out again. There is a huge opportunity for a bunch of owner operators to get together and start a cooperative. And they can get insurance like all of a sudden once, and I don't know what the I think that the ceiling has changed. It used to be 10 trucks at one time, and I think the insurance companies have raised it to 12 or 20 depending on the country and the insurance companies. But once you get X number of trucks, you get fleet insurance. Now all of a sudden you can all run under one banner, but you have to do things accordingly.
Right.
And then you could have a sales force.
Right. That's interesting. I like that idea.
Yeah, and I've pushed it. I had dinner with some people in at Matt's that all have. There was a whole group of them.
Right.
And they're all friends, and they all have the same type of equipment. They've got open wagons that are, with the tarp system. Everybody's got them. Yep. And I said, you guys are the future. This is all you have to do. But they were apprehensive.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I hate to be the party pooper,
but you always are every damn week, Rico.
Wow, that went quick.
I want to be respectful of the time. Dean takes, we don't have a payroll around here, and he's so gracious enough to come on and share information with us and everything else. And I never want to disrespect his time. We definitely appreciate him for taking the time out to come on board with us and share information and discuss with us. So Dean, we went over a little bit, but if you don't mind, let everyone know where they can find your wonderful work and where.
Yeah, sure. On LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Just hit me up with a direct message, Dean Croke, CROKE. You can find me fairly active on social media on the Instagram platform at the Grumpy Pete. Or if you've got questions specific to the freight market, ask IQ@dat.com. Fire off an email there. That was funny, Chuck. I love all the comments. Thanks for all the comments, listeners. I'm fascinated by some of them. Ask IQ@dat.com. And of course, Rico, you've been a guest on our show, as has Chuck. We have a show on every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern. DAT Freight and Analytics. We give a freight market update there every week, so you can catch us there also.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Dean, for being so good.
Yes, thank you so much
for coming on and helping us out, helping us kind of demystify and walk through the seasonality and the regionality of the industry.
Yep.
Definitely appreciate it. Chuck, let the
Thank you guys.
Where they can find you. Thanks again.
The best way these days is send me an email, chucksnow280@outlook.com. Put your phone number on the email. Chances are I'm going to answer you via phone and find out how to help you or whatever I can do for you. Don't hesitate. If there's anything you need, whether it's getting set up with my former company Trafix, or you're just having a tough time in this market, I may have a solution for you. So with that, Rico, I'm going to let you back her in a hole for another week.
Yes, indeed. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again. Tell a friend about the show. Like, share, and subscribe. Hit the little bell icon if you're looking at us on YouTube. That helps us. Doesn't cost you a thing, but we appreciate all of you guys. We want you guys to remember to stay safe out there, stay healthy, and God willing, we'll talk at your same time, same place next week. God bless you and good night. Keep it in between the mustard and the mayonnaise.
Catch on the flip-flop. God bless.
Good night, gentlemen.